Imagine a massive warship floating through the sky, launching fighter planes from its belly while cruising at 8,000 feet. Sounds like science fiction, right? But in the 1930s, the United States Navy actually built two of these giants, the USS Akron and USS Macon, floating aircraft carriers that were longer than 2 football fields and filled with millions of cubic feet of helium. These weren't just experimental toys. They were serious military investments, each costing the equivalent of hundreds of millions in today's dollars. The Navy believed these airship carriers would revolutionize naval warfare, serving as flying scout platforms that could patrol vast stretches of ocean while carrying their own fleet of fighter planes. But within just a few years, both ships would crash into the sea, taking dozens of lives with them and ending one of the most ambitious and bizarre experiments in American military history. This is the story of the flying aircraft carriers that failed and why the dream of airship carriers died in the storms of the Atlantic. The story begins in the aftermath of World War I, when military strategists around the world were reimagining what future warfare might look like. The Great War had proven that aircraft would play a crucial role in modern combat, but the technology of the time had serious limitations. Planes couldn't fly very far, they couldn't stay aloft for long, and they couldn't carry much fuel or weaponry. Meanwhile, rigid airships, also known as dirigibles or zeppelins, had proven remarkably effective during the war. The Germans had used zeppelins to bomb London and patrol vast areas of ocean. These massive lighter-than-air vessels could stay airborne for days, cover thousands of miles, and carry substantial payloads. American naval planners looked at these capabilities and saw an opportunity. What if you could combine the range and endurance of an airship with the reconnaissance and combat capabilities of aircraft? The result would be a flying aircraft carrier, a massive airship that could patrol the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, launch scout planes to search for enemy fleets, and potentially even engage in combat operations. The concept was ambitious, even audacious, but the Navy was convinced it could work. Congress approved funding, and the Navy contracted with the Goodyear Zeppelin Corporation to build 2 massive airships, the USS Akron and USS Macon. The USS Akron took to the skies for the first time in September 1931, and it was an absolute marvel of engineering. The airship stretched 785 feet from nose to tail, making it longer than many ocean-going warships of the era. Its envelope, the giant balloon portion, held over 6 million cubic feet of helium, a non-flammable gas that was far safer than the hydrogen used in most other airships. The internal structure was made of a revolutionary aluminum alloy called duralumin, strong yet lightweight, formed into massive rings and girders that gave the airship its shape. 8 powerful engines, each producing 500 horsepower, were mounted on the sides of the hull, giving the Akron a top speed of about 80 miles per hour. But the truly revolutionary feature was hidden inside. The Akron had an internal hangar bay that could hold up to 5 small fighter planes, specifically the Curtiss F-9C Sparrowhawk, a nimble biplane designed specifically for airship operations. The hangar had a retractable trapeze system, a mechanical arm that could lower through an opening in the bottom of the airship. Pilots would fly their planes up to the trapeze, hook onto it with a special fitting mounted on top of their aircraft, and then be winched up into the hangar bay. It was an incredibly complex and dangerous maneuver, requiring precise flying skills and nerves of steel. Once aboard, the planes could be serviced, refueled, and then launched again by simply reversing the process. The pilots would climb into their cockpits, the trapeze would lower them out of the hangar, and they would unhook and fly away. In theory, this gave the Navy a mobile scouting platform that could launch reconnaissance aircraft hundreds of miles from the American coast. The Akron entered service with great fanfare, conducting training exercises and demonstration flights along the East Coast. The sight of the massive silver giant cruising through the sky, with tiny fighter planes buzzing around it like protective wasps, captured the public imagination. Newspapers ran breathless stories about the future of naval aviation. Military officials from around the world came to observe the operations. For a brief moment, it seemed like the United States had leapfrogged every other nation in terms of naval technology. But problems emerged almost immediately. Airships, even ones as advanced as the Akron, were incredibly vulnerable to weather. Unlike heavier-than-air aircraft, which could often power through turbulence or avoid storms, airships were at the mercy of wind and atmospheric conditions. The massive surface area of the envelope acted like a sail, catching every gust of wind. Thunderstorms were particularly dangerous, with powerful updrafts and downdrafts that could tear the delicate structure apart or slam it into the ground. The Navy quickly learned that the Akron could only operate safely in relatively calm conditions, which severely limited its usefulness as a long-range patrol platform. There were other problems too. The trapeze system, while innovative, was incredibly difficult to use. Pilots had to approach the swaying airship, match its speed exactly, and then hook onto the trapeze while flying just a few feet below the massive hull. In rough weather, this was nearly impossible. Several pilots had close calls, and the Navy began to question whether the system could ever be reliable enough for combat operations. The airship itself was also difficult to handle. It required a large ground crew to bring it in and out of its hangar, and even small mistakes could result in damage. The operational costs were staggering, far higher than anyone had anticipated. On April 4, 1933, just 18 months after entering service, the USS Akron met its end. The airship was conducting a flight along the New Jersey coast when it encountered a severe storm over the Atlantic Ocean. The crew tried to navigate through the turbulence, but the winds were too powerful. Updrafts and downdrafts tossed the massive airship like a toy. At some point, the crew lost control, and the Akron plummeted toward the ocean. It struck the water with tremendous force, and the impact shattered the delicate internal structure. The airship sank quickly, taking 73 men down with it, including Rear Admiral William Moffett, the chief of the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics, and one of the biggest advocates for the airship program. Only 3 men survived the crash. It remains one of the worst aviation disasters in American history.
You might think that losing the Akron and 73 lives would have ended the flying aircraft carrier experiment, but you would be wrong. The Navy had already commissioned a sister ship, the USS Macon, which had been under construction when the Akron crashed. Rather than cancel the program, the Navy conducted an investigation, made some design improvements, and pressed ahead. The Macon was completed and entered service in 1933, just months after the Akron disaster. The Macon was nearly identical to its ill-fated sister ship, with the same basic design and capabilities. The Navy hoped that lessons learned from the Akron disaster would make the Macon safer and more reliable. The new airship was assigned to the Pacific Fleet and operated out of Moffett Field in California, conducting training exercises and patrol missions along the West Coast. For a while, it seemed like the modifications had worked. The Macon conducted dozens of successful flights, and the Navy began to regain confidence in the concept. But the fundamental problems remained, and on February 12, 1935, the Macon encountered its own disaster. The airship was conducting a training flight off the California coast when it flew into an area of turbulent air. The Macon was still vulnerable to weather, still expensive to operate, and still difficult to handle. The turbulence caused a structural failure in the upper fin, and the damage allowed helium to escape from some of the internal gas cells. The crew tried to compensate by dropping ballast, but they couldn't stop the airship from descending. The Macon settled relatively gently into the Pacific Ocean, and thanks to better life-saving equipment and procedures implemented after the Akron disaster, only 2 of the 83 crew members were killed. But the airship itself was a total loss, sinking to the ocean floor where it remains to this day. The loss of the Macon effectively ended the U.S. Navy's experiment with flying aircraft carriers. 2 massive, expensive airships had been built, and both had crashed into the ocean within 4 years. The Navy conducted another investigation, but the conclusions were clear. Rigid airships were simply too vulnerable to weather and structural failure to serve as reliable military platforms. The technology that had seemed so promising just a few years earlier was fundamentally flawed. The future of naval aviation would belong to conventional aircraft carriers, ships made of steel that could withstand storms and carry far more aircraft than any airship ever could. So why did the flying aircraft carriers fail? The reasons are complex, but several key factors stand out. First, and most importantly, airships were too vulnerable to weather. No amount of engineering could overcome the basic physics of a massive, lightweight structure floating through the atmosphere. Storms that conventional ships or aircraft could endure would tear airships apart. Second, the technology was incredibly complex and expensive. Operating an airship required specialized crews, enormous hangars, and constant maintenance. The costs were simply unsustainable, especially during the Great Depression. Third, the tactical advantages were smaller than anticipated. The airships could patrol large areas, but so could long-range patrol planes, which were becoming more capable every year. The ability to launch and recover fighter planes was impressive, but the trapeze system was so difficult to use that it had limited practical value. There's also a broader lesson here about military innovation. The Navy's airship program was bold and forward-thinking, but it was based on flawed assumptions about what future warfare would require. The admirals who championed the program were looking backward, trying to solve the problems of World War I rather than anticipating the challenges of World War II. They believed that long-range reconnaissance would be the key to naval warfare, and they were right about that. But they were wrong about how to accomplish it.
By the time the Macon crashed, advances in radio technology, radar, and long-range aircraft were already making airships obsolete. Today, the wrecks of both airships lie on the ocean floor, serving as monuments to one of the most ambitious failures in military history. The Akron is somewhere in the Atlantic, but its exact location has never been found. The Macon was discovered off the California coast in 1990, lying in about 1,500 feet of water. Researchers have explored the wreck site and recovered artifacts, including parts of the Sparrowhawk fighters that went down with the ship. These relics offer a tangible connection to an era when anything seemed possible, when military planners genuinely believed that the future of warfare would be fought from giant airships floating through the sky. The story of the USS Akron and USS Macon is ultimately a story about the risks and rewards of innovation. The Navy took a chance on revolutionary technology, invested enormous resources, and pushed the boundaries of what was possible. It didn't work out. Both airships crashed, dozens of men died, and millions of dollars were wasted. But the lessons learned weren't entirely in vain. The experience taught the Navy important lessons about aircraft carrier operations, aerial reconnaissance, and the importance of adapting to changing technology. And who knows, maybe those lessons help save lives and win battles in the years to come. The flying aircraft carriers may have failed, but the spirit of innovation they represented, the willingness to take risks and try something new, that's something worth remembering.